or are only happening in sort of negligible numbers. Having that reporting also helps educate law enforcement officers on who the most at-risk communities are, and that way they can reallocate their resources to make sure that they are adequately able to keep our communities safe. And for organizations like Equality Florida, having accurate reporting certainly helps us in our work to combat prejudice, stigma, and other forms of discrimination if we know where and how these things are occurring.
Yeah.
So one of the good motivators there for encouraging reporting is actually the Municipal Equality Index that the Human Rights Campaign puts out on an annual basis. And one of the criteria that they evaluate local governments on is whether or not those cities report hate crime statistics to the FBI. And so in the most recent rankings that have been published, which were actually the 2018 rankings, there were 15 cities in Florida that reported hate crimes to the FBI and 5 that did not. But that percentage is not representative because we know there are a lot of smaller jurisdictions that just never report their hate crimes federally at all because there's not a sort of standing requirement to do so.
You mentioned, gender identity is one of the things you're working on because it's not covered. Have you and other equality issues, focused on gender identity recently? Because that seems to be one of the big topics, and like I'm talking with the bathrooms and, other.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll say, I think the gender identity issues are so important in our conversations about hate crimes in particular, because we know that our trans and non-binary community is one of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And just last year, we had 5 transgender women of color who were murdered in Florida. That accounted for nearly a quarter of all the murder of transgender individuals that were reported nationwide. So,
wow.
Fortunately, Florida is not such an outlier in the wrong direction this year, but I believe there have already been at least 16 trans individuals killed this year because we know that they're at an incredibly high risk for hate-motivated violence. So it's one of the reasons that Equality Florida is so committed to this work with the Florida Hate Crimes Coalition. But in terms of our legislative slate more broadly, we also see the importance of establishing comprehensive protections for the LGBTQ community in Florida's Civil Rights Act. And so that battle has really focused around what's called the Florida Competitive Workforce Act. And that would simply add sexual orientation and gender identity to Florida's existing 1992 Civil Rights Act.
Interesting.
That Civil Rights Act provides non-discrimination protections in housing, employment, and public accommodations. And the issue that you touched on earlier is really a public accommodations issue. That's where we hear the most sort of fear-mongering and extremist talking points about bathroom issues and locker room issues. And we also know that it's one of the areas that our trans and non-binary community is the most vulnerable. And so last session, there was another bill introduced that would have only provided equality for the LGBTQ community in employment. And it really was pitched as sort of an incremental take what you can get strategy. And what we saw was that it clearly failed to pick up any new supporters who hadn't already supported the Competitive Workforce Act's fully comprehensive protections. But it seemed to be couched as an out to not have to address public accommodations and to not have to address bathrooms and locker rooms in a way that was really seeking progress at the expense of protections that are so vital for our transgender and non-binary community.
Wow. Hey, well, so does Equality Florida offer any, other than reporting services, does Equality Florida offer any type of assistance or help, or is partnered with anyone that can help people when, they are the victims of hate crimes or inequality issues?
Sure, we do. We often work with local organizations that do more provision of direct services.
Hmm.
When it comes to issues like hate crimes and other forms of discrimination, we work very closely with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, NCLR. They're a terrific partner. We really have several organizations that we work with on legal and policy matters. In addition to NCLR, there's also the Southern Poverty Law Center, ACLU,
Hmm.
and a number of other organizations, even LGBTQ specific, like Lambda Legal, that provide a lot of assistance and expertise there. And with respect to hate crimes, one of the other areas that we've really tried to build a lot of cultural competency is directly with law enforcement. And so,
Hmm.
in the context of gender identity, particularly after we saw this spate of murder of transgender women of color, and several of them occurring in the Jacksonville area last year, Gina Duncan, who's our terrific director of transgender inclusion, went back and did sort of recertification of both the law enforcement officers and their supervisors and managers to make sure, again, that our law enforcement officers have the training they need to respond to these sort of issues, and that they have the competency to deal with communities that at times, are more reserved or concerned about reaching out to help to law enforcement at times. So I think a lot of that, really trying to build cultural competency and also encouraging local governments to have things like an LGBTQ liaison in the city government and in the law enforcement agencies goes a long way to establishing that trust that can help keep folks in our community so much safer.
Yeah. Now, do you think that's fairly common? I mean, thinking about it right now, it would make sense to me that, a lot of law enforcement organizations might not really know how to deal with LGBTQ or trans people, and you know, um, could themselves violate their rights without even knowing it.
That's true. I mean, and we always certainly assume best intentions, but it really is a
Right.
place that we see a need for education. In another area of our policy work is around HIV issues, and the community of people of living in Florida who are living with HIV is
Hmm.
another segment where we see sometimes a big disconnect or a reticence to reach out to law enforcement for help. But where we've started having some opportunities to do education with law enforcement, so that when they do talk to folks who may be living with HIV or are engaging in behaviors that make them highly susceptible to HIV, that they know more about linkage to care or measures for prevention and treatment, so that they can share that information again to help keep Floridians safe.
Yeah.
I think it's some place that we're starting to see progress, and we do see now a number of local governments starting to have LGBTQ liaisons, but there's certainly more that can be done, and we've got a ways to go.
Yeah. Well, you can say that again. I mean, that's it really, to me, it's really scary sometimes how some people treat anyone in the LGBTQ community. It's yeah, it's really a sad situation. I've heard some
Yeah.
negative stuff said about Mayor Pete lately, and it makes no sense because I listen to the guy, and I think he's a viable candidate, and the type of guy that we probably would want sitting in the White House compared to maybe what's sitting there right now. So um,
that
you
that seems fair.
know, yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anything you'd like to uh, tell our listeners, because we are running out of time?
I will put in a quick plug. I mean, if these are issues that folks care about, It's very easy to get involved with Equality Florida. We certainly have local events all over the state, whether those are activist trainings or outreach events like tabling at Pride issues. The one that is most near and dear to my heart, of course, is our annual Lobby Days event. That will be January 27th and 28th up in Tallahassee this year. And it makes such an impact for folks to be in the Capitol and have those face-to-face meetings and be able to share with our lawmakers, why this legislation is so important to them and the impact that it has on their lives or the lives of those that they love. So folks can go to eqfl.org and learn more about some of those opportunities.
That's great. Sounds really, really good. Well, Jon Harris, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. It was really interesting stuff, and maybe we can get you back sometime and get an update on how the legislation is going.
Yeah, sounds great. I'd love to do it.
Okay, great. And to our listeners, you have been listening to the Coastal Rainbow Forum, and we hope that you will tune in again next week.